Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited to host today's webinar on No Supply Chain, No Gain, How Offshore Wind Can Boost Local Economies. My name is Stephanie Gagnon, and I am the Manager for Regional Programs at C2ES, or the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. Some quick housekeeping before we get started. A note that this webinar is being recorded and the recording will be posted on the C2ES YouTube page. It will also be shared in a follow-up email with registrants. So if you registered for this webinar, you'll receive that link in your email. Today, I will open the webinar with an introduction to C2ES and the Regional Roundtable Program. Then we'll hear from Matt Shields on a presentation on a supply chain roadmap for offshore wind energy in the United States. Following that, I will introduce the rest of the panelists. They'll each give some quick remarks, and then we'll get into the question and answer period of the discussion portion of the webinar. We are reserving about 15 to 20 minutes at the end of the webinar for audience questions, and we really look forward to answering some of your questions. I know we've received some already through the registration page. If you'd like to submit a question, just use the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen. That will submit the question to us, and we'll hopefully try to get through all of them in those last 20 minutes. You can submit those questions at any time. So some quick background before we get started on the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, especially if you're a first-time listener, welcome. We're happy to have you. If you're joining us for the second time, welcome back, or subsequent times after that, we're happy to have you. For those who aren't familiar with our work, the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank, and we work to accelerate the transition to net zero greenhouse gas emissions and a thriving, just, resilient economy. We were founded in 1998 as the first organization focused solely on climate change. And since our founding, we've worked with our now 41-company Business Environmental Leadership Council, or BELC, to integrate the experience and expertise of the private sector into policy design and advocacy. One of the programs, which I'll be talking a little bit more about today, that we host is our Regional Roundtable program. Next slide. This is a program that's been going since 2020, and you can see in this graphic, a series of the locations, topics, and years that we've hosted those roundtables. This is an opportunity for us to localize the climate policy conversation to communities around the country. So you can see the communities that we've visited throughout the past 4 years of the program. The goal of the program is to elevate the perspectives of a diverse set of stakeholders that are deeply embedded in their communities and that are uniquely positioned to speak to the needs of their states and regions. The kinds of stakeholders that we engage in these conversations include local, state, and federal policymakers, businesses of all sizes, community organizations and nonprofits, leading academics and issue experts, trade associations and labor organizations, investors and philanthropy, and many others. Our goal is to create opportunities to integrate these local perspectives into state and federal policy contexts, and we hope to emerge from the conversation with concrete steps that can align long-term economic prosperity and economy-wide decarbonization. I think if you see in the chat, there should be a link to our Regional Roundtable webpage. I encourage you to check that out. You can see a list of all of the places that we visited so far, the issues that we focused on in those conversations, and most of those places we've already released a policy brief detailing what we've talked about in the conversations, the key themes from the discussion, and a series of policy recommendations for state and federal policymakers stemming from that discussion. Next slide. Today, we're going to be talking about offshore wind and specifically focusing on Virginia Beach, or Virginia, and New Orleans and Louisiana. These are two roundtables that we've hosted over the past year. In October of 2022, we were in Virginia Beach talking about offshore wind opportunities in the mid-Atlantic. And recently in February of this past year, we were in New Orleans discussing a similar topic. I'm not going to get into everything that we've talked about here. I encourage you to check out our website to see the full list of key takeaways and policy recommendations in the brief for each state. And I think those links are also in the chat as well. I will say that I think we saw a lot of fantastic synergies between the two locations that we hosted the roundtables in, and we learned a lot from the folks in each roundtable sharing their perspective on what the opportunities they see for their regions in the offshore wind industry are and how they hope they're able to realize them. Certainly, Virginia Beach is farther along in developing their offshore wind industry, seeing as they already have a project that is being developed, and we'll hear from John a little bit more about that later today. But there are similarities across both in the opportunity between each state to leverage their assets like port infrastructure, their skilled workforce, and expertise from other sectors that can support a local thriving offshore wind industry. Next slide. To back out just a little bit, I did want to give a little bit of context for why we're talking about offshore wind now, some of the momentum that we're seeing in the US. for offshore wind, just to situate today's webinar among the broader context. And I don't want to preempt anything that Matt is about to tell you, because we're going to hear a lot more about this in his presentation next. That said, despite some of the challenges around permitting and inflation concerns, momentum is continuing to build in the US for an offshore wind industry. There's more than 40 gigawatts in a project pipeline, and we've seen strong federal support both from the White House and from Congress with a series of investments and incentives through the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. There's also significant state-level procurement targets and planned investments and ongoing investments in building out that supply chain. But why is it important that we have a domestic supply chain? In particular, what we heard across both roundtables and what we've heard from other stakeholders throughout the industry is that as the US industry for offshore wind and the global industry in offshore wind start to ramp up, it becomes increasingly competitive for companies and industry to access the components and the vessels that are needed to build out the industry at the pace and scale that we need to meet our decarbonization goals by mid-century. Additionally, the sheer size of the components makes it advantageous to the industry to build them near where they're going to be launched to build the projects. And it allows us to put US workers' skills to use. Finally, there's a huge opportunity for communities to benefit not only from the renewable energy and the electrons that they'll be receiving from the projects, but also to work those jobs, to hire local professionals, and to benefit from those investments in local infrastructure. Next slide. I'm not really going to go into all of these key takeaways. Our speakers will cover this much better than I will. But I did just want to share a main takeaway that we saw from across both of these roundtables and that we continue to see from the roundtables that we've hosted around the country over the last 4 years. In particular, in these roundtables, stakeholders from across the sectors recognize that the offshore wind industry produces economic opportunity for communities. They also identified many next steps that are needed to take advantage of it. And we heard from companies, policymakers, and communities that they need to put in the work to make sure that these opportunities can be realized, but they're ready. And so with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Matt Shields is the Senior Offshore Wind Energy Analyst at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. He joined NREL in 2018, and he leads the lab's work on offshore wind techno-economic analysis, which involves developing cost models, analyzing market and technology trends, and projecting the future cost of offshore wind. He's conducted analysis on the cost impacts of turbine and plant upsizing, supply chain opportunities for the domestic offshore wind industry, floating wind, marine logistics, and the feasibility assessments for novel technological solutions. Matt, we are so excited to have you here with us today, and I will hand it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie. And it looks like the slides are up, and hopefully everyone can hear me okay. Yeah, really appreciate the introduction and the opportunity to speak here today. And I think that was an excellent summary of some of basically the state of the industry and kind of where we're going for some of these supply chain questions. So so thanks for the segue there, Stephanie. I think you can go to the next slide. Okay, so in the last couple of years, NREL has done some work with a huge series of partners and collaborators throughout the industry to kind of look at what a domestic supply chain could look like by the 2030 timeframe. So certainly we have this goal set by the Biden administration to have 30 gigawatts of offshore wind installed by 2030. And we were looking at what would it mean to also stand up a supply chain in that same timeframe. So we've been looking at what are the barriers, gaps, and solutions to building up the manufacturing, port, and vessel and workforce needs to support this supply chain, while also maintaining equity and sustainability principles as you go through those decision-making processes. Next slide. So I'll just touch on this a little bit more. Stephanie mentioned a few of these as well, but there are some major barriers to setting up a supply chain in the U.S. I think first and foremost is that you see this investment risk where there's uncertainty about exactly when the projects are going to get built, what the pipeline looks like after the existing projects that we know of, although we do have 40 or 50 gigawatts in the pipeline right now. And then on top of that, just exactly when those projects are going to be signing their supplier agreements makes it a little bit uncertain about when and kind of where the supply chain needs to develop. On top of that, we see like technology challenges where it's as technology continues to evolve, you want to make sure that you're sort of future-proofed in these massive investments. The supplier networks, so like the raw materials and the subcomponents and subassemblies, and the ports and vessels and the workforce aren't quite where they need to be. We've got existing capabilities and assets in these different areas, but there's a lot of specialization needed for offshore wind. And it's the same kind of issue of like, when do you make the investments in order to have the resources in place at the right time when the offshore wind projects need them? There's always questions about whether a U.S. supply chain can be cost competitive with an international one, and we have seen some of the legislation come through, such as the IRA, which is helping with that cost competitiveness. And then finally, it is important to consider equity and sustainability in decision making, but that can be time intensive and resource intensive. So how do you balance the need to kind of get things built while making sure you're not adding burdens onto vulnerable communities? Next slide, please. So we estimated, as a report that we published earlier this year, what a domestic supply chain would look like. What's the investment needed by 2030 to get this infrastructure in place? And there's, at a high level, we would expect you probably need something in the order of 30 to 35 new manufacturing facilities, and probably above $20 billion of investment in the manufacturing facilities, the ports, and the vessels that you need. And that's just kind of the major installation vessels like feeder barges and wind turbine installation vessels. And that installation, or that investment, really needs to take place over the next 3, 4, 5 years, so that then that infrastructure can be in place, not just sort of financially committed to by the end of the decade. And the quicker we can make those investments, the more you can start to transition to more and more domestic manufacturing, reduce some of that uncertainty in the investments, claim more of the available tax credit in the IRA, and be able to support more projects within the offshore wind pipeline. Next slide, thanks. So a big piece of the supply chain is vessels, and what you need, what the fleet needs to look like in order to install components. And I should really say ports and vessels here. We did some modeling within this report study, and on the figure on the left here, you can kind of see a Gantt chart of all the projects in the pipeline on the East Coast, assuming that we don't invest in any more ports and vessels than we've already kind of committed to. And that puts more than half of the pipeline at risk of not being installed by 2030. You just see these significant delays kind of crop up. If we invest more, we can build more quickly. And probably you need to invest $6 to $7 billion in ports and vessels in order to give ourselves a chance of meeting our installation timeframes. But the timing matters on this as well. I mean, the money's not the only piece of it. The question is, when can you actually get these vessels built? Is there availability in the shipyards? What's the permitting process like to get a port put together, and so forth? So there's the investment is one piece, and then the timing is another piece, and then how you're engaging with those local businesses and local communities is a third piece on that as well. So this shows, I think, it is possible to get our infrastructure in place by 2030. But there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and a high level of investment that would be required to put us in that position. And I'll just mention as well that although this result kind of talks about feeder barges and wind turbine installation vessels, there's a need for dozens, maybe hundreds of additional vessels within this pipeline, where we look at support vessels, operation vessels, cable vessels, rock laying vessels. I mean, there's a big fleet and much more investment than even what we considered in this slide, which is going to be needed. Next slide, please. So, of course, the manufacturing facilities come with jobs. People need to be working in these facilities. And when we look at these scenarios that we put together, probably by 2030, you might need in the order of 10,000 jobs. Or by the 2030s, you might need about 10,000 jobs working in those tier 1 manufacturing facilities. So making the blades and the foundations and so forth. But one of the things that I think we found was quite interesting is that the opportunity within the broader supply chain is much, much bigger than those jobs in the tier 1 manufacturing facilities. So these could be existing small and medium-sized companies that are making parts, materials, subcomponents, subassemblies that feed into the final wind turbine product. And this is a real opportunity space for existing businesses in the US to kind of transition into. Next slide. And a final point that I would make is that we looked kind of state by state, and the skill sets needed for these jobs exist in a lot of different places. It's not just in the North Atlantic where the first projects are being built. So there's an opportunity for many states to contribute to the offshore wind supply chain. What we need is a better understanding of how to kind of coordinate regionally. So how can we understand what's the right role for the Gulf of Mexico, for the South Atlantic, for the North Atlantic, for the West Coast, for the center of the country even, because there are capabilities that can be leveraged for the offshore wind supply chain. We need to understand what those relevant skill sets are, what the comparative advantages are region by region, and again, how we can kind of do this from a equitable and fair standpoint for the region. Next slide, please. So I would just say that this is kind of the time when states and regions are actively beginning to identify the role in a broader national supply chain conversation. At the national level, we see a coordination between the White House and the Department of Energy to lead a working group with states on the East Coast about supply chain solutions. We see the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management incorporating supply chain funding into some of their into some of the lease awards. At the state level, there's also some support for these through procurement mechanisms and offtake agreements to invest in new supply chains. But there's a need for these states to be figuring out what is the strength of a state? What can I do with my businesses? What can I do with my local communities? And how can I work with other states in order to figure out my role in the supply chain? Next slide. And so just to kind of finalize here on the last slide, and with the focus today being on some of the ongoing work in both Louisiana and Virginia, these are two states that have really, I think, tangible and explicit examples of how you can start to build a supply chain and build activities within a state, even if the first offshore wind project in your region isn't being built. Louisiana has 6 offshore wind vessels under construction as we speak, and quite a few more in the pipeline. So this is one of the first and most most visible examples of building what we need to actually start getting projects installed. And again, this isn't even for projects in the Gulf. This is immediately going to serve projects in the North Atlantic. We've seen an agreement between GNO Inc. and the offshore wind developer RWE to start a supply chain program with a database of businesses and skill sets in the region that can be used broadly throughout the industry. Similarly, Shell and Gulf Wind have put together a technology accelerator to help facilitate demonstration projects, build workforce, and sort of de-risk some of the development of offshore wind in the Gulf. And the goal is for these sort of hubs and these activities to build off of a lot of the expertise, which we know is already in Louisiana, from manufacturing for oil and gas to transportation and marine logistics. So I think this is a nice pathway where we know there's existing skill sets and there's programs in place to kind of transfer these specifically to the offshore wind industry. Somewhat similarly in Virginia, Virginia has an active offshore wind project, which is undergoing development right now, although it hasn't started construction yet. And there's an announced blade facility at the Portsmouth Marine Terminal there. So this is kind of the gravity almost, which is pulling the supply chain and aspects of the supply chain to Virginia. We've seen the state government release development grants, which can help small businesses and medium-sized businesses begin to transition and pivot to offshore wind. Dominion and the Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind Project have held workshops helping to provide more information to these businesses and are developing a supply chain registry for the region. And NREL is actually kicking off a study looking into how the Central Atlantic states, so Virginia, North Carolina, Maryland, and Delaware, can collaborate on supply chain and workforce solutions. So this is the type of study where we can really understand what that competitive advantage is of that particular region. Next slide, thanks. And so that's all for me, just to kind of set the table here. I think we'll learn a lot more about some of these programs and some of the ongoing state activities from some of my co-panelists in the next few minutes.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Matt. Great presentation, and I think perfect segue into our next panelists. So briefly, I'm going to introduce each panelist. They'll introduce themselves for a couple of minutes, and then we can get into the discussion. Up speaking next, I'd like to introduce Matt Smith, who's the Director of Energy and Water Technology at the Hampton Roads Alliance. Matt's role at the Alliance is to develop and promote Hampton Roads as a clean energy hub, including for the offshore wind industry. Before joining the Alliance, Matt was a senior regional planner at the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission, where he worked in the areas of strategic, environmental, and comprehensive planning. Over to you, Matt.
All right, thanks, Stephanie. Appreciate being here today to talk about offshore wind supply chain development. So I will talk a little bit about the Hampton Roads Alliance and also specifically about our supply chain development program. So as my slides are coming up, I will, great, there you go. So the Hampton Roads Alliance is the regional economic development organization that represents the southeastern area of Virginia there, where you see the star on the map. And our broad goal is to grow the economy of Hampton Roads. And we do that through key industry sectors. And 3 years ago, we made offshore wind one of the key industry sectors that we are focusing on. And that has been reflected at the state level as well, with the Virginia Economic Development Partnership designating that as a key sector. And so with that designation, we have stood up a dedicated supply chain development program that I'll explain if you go to the next slide. So that program, we were fortunate to gain some funding from the state of Virginia in 2020 that has allowed us to stand that up, and we've continued it since then. And really, it has four main components to the program, and happy to answer questions and go deeper into it later on in the presentation. But those components are really attracting investment to the Commonwealth of Virginia, helping existing businesses grow in the offshore wind industry, fostering education and innovation, and then facilitating site readiness and development for the purpose of offshore wind. And so really, we're intending to grow the capacity of our offshore wind industry in Virginia, but really to the benefit of the industry as a whole. But the key to that program, I'll say, has been our intense focus on working with partners. And so this isn't just an initiative that the Alliance is doing by ourselves. Our success so far has really been dependent on kind of working across government and private industry, trade associations, and also the developers in our region. And so when companies look to potentially locate in Hampton Roads or grow in Hampton Roads, we can connect them with the right folks to be successful. Next slide, please. And then we also are fortunate to work with some just really great kind of native assets that we have in our region, what we would call unmatched port infrastructure and an already very large and skilled maritime workforce around the shipbuilding and ship repair industries, kind of the strategic mid-Atlantic location we have, our business climate. And so while the other Matt made a great point about the need for specialized resources, I think we're starting with a good base. So looking forward to continuing this discussion and answering your questions. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Really looking forward to continuing this discussion in the next portion of the program. I'd also now like to introduce Cam Poole, who's an Energy and Innovation Associate at Greater New Orleans Inc. GNO Inc. is the regional economic development organization for Southeast Louisiana, and we heard from the other Matt a little bit earlier about the supply chain initiative that GNO is working on with RWE. In his role, Cam supports the H to the Future initiative, which I think we're about to hear about shortly, led by GNO, as well as managing the GNO Wind Alliance program. Over to you, Cam.
Thanks for the introduction, Stephanie, and thanks to C2ES for organizing the discussion today. Going to give you guys a little context on the Greater New Orleans Inc. and our two particular programs that are sort of targeting industrial decarbonization, primarily by way of supporting the offshore wind proposition for the Gulf of Mexico, with Louisiana in mind in particular. Next slide, please. So GNO Inc services can, similar to many other regional economic development organizations, are to support what we view as business development and business environment for our 10 parish region. What we'll note when we get into some of our energy programs, though, is that we've really expanded the base of partnership. And like Matt Smith said, none of this can be done in a silo. This requires a lot of industry coordination, public-private coordination, and GNO Inc sitting in between state economic development offices and our local parishes really try to support. I sit on the business development team, so I work a lot with our local businesses as well as those trying to take advantage of the federal incentives Matt Shields alluded to by way of the IRA to come land here and take a part of this really exciting energy evolution we're seeing take place here in the United States. But also our team supports business environment. We work very closely on local policy to support these renewable energy. Can you all hear me, Steph? I think I froze.
Yeah, it looks like you're back now.
Okay, so did you all hear the organizational overview? My apologies.
Yeah, if you could just go back about 1 minute.
Cool. So basically our services boil down to business development, supporting companies and landing here in Louisiana, but also building a strong business environment by way of policy efforts, working closely with our state on some of the policies I'll be discussing later that really set us up well to pursue these offshore wind and clean hydrogen opportunities, but also making sure investments translate to meaningful workforce development. Next slide, please. So this gives you a snapshot of that really strong public-private base of support and the program that we use here at GNO Inc to really support the rollout of offshore wind and public-private coordination around that opportunity. So you'll see Louisiana Economic Development, other agencies, port systems, private partners, et cetera. We all convene monthly in a hybrid setting. We'll sometimes take people around to key assets and infrastructure like Port Fourchon, which is a global base of operations for oil and gas, similarly strategically setting itself up to service wind. And we really try to convene these partners around these opportunities, helping them follow the market along. As Matt Shields said, as exciting as this opportunity is, we have a lot of small and medium-sized suppliers in this group who really rely on the GNO Wind Alliance to get a greater sense of these investment opportunities, when they can expect to really be engaging these developers on potential procurement, but also helping connect industry with our universities. And that really segues to how the GNO Wind Alliance really works on the basis of the H to the Future program. So if we can go to the next slide there. So again, Louisiana, similar to Virginia, we have a really strong basis of infrastructure, leading ports nationally by way of tonnage or just export activity. We have some of the most immense LNG pipelines and hydrogen infrastructure as well. And we saw at GNO Inc saw an opportunity to really capitalize this and empower that infrastructure and strong workforce base in the pursuit of industrial carbonization. And so that's the H to the Future program. It's an initiative of 25 plus partners all across the South Boot of Louisiana, from Lake Charles to New Orleans, working together across 5 verticals, from test beds, from CCUS to offshore wind powered electrolysis, to workforce development initiatives with community colleges at the forefront to ensure accessibility, and really understanding that for Louisiana, power to X offtake pathway or offshore wind to clean hydrogen is really going to be what unlocks the value and creates the greatest impact for our state. The clean hydrogen case is particularly important because we not only have the right infrastructure to develop it, but we have the highest per capita consumption of clean hydrogen. So it's really where we can decarbonize our hard to abate sectors, for which there's a great concentration in the state. So if you go to the next slide, that sort of just provides that overview of how GNO Wind and H to the Future are working together to support a strong foundation for the Power to X pathway in Louisiana. And we're looking forward to talking a little bit more about what we've been working on. Thank you.
Thanks, Kim. That's such an interesting project, and I'm really excited to be able to discuss that a little bit more shortly. Speaking of companies that are working on offshore wind that are part of these collaborations, I'd like to introduce next John Larson, who's the Director of Public Policy and Economic Development at Dominion Energy. John joined Dominion Energy in 1996 and is currently the Director of Public Policy and Economic Development. During his career at the company, he's held various leadership positions in business development, alternative energy technologies, as well as transmission, construction, and operations. He's well-versed in offshore wind through his experience in the development and early permitting activities for the coastal Virginia offshore wind pilot project. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Stephanie. Couple of slides. So I'll just take a few moments and give you a very brief overview of the coastal Virginia offshore wind project. These are pictures of the 2 pilot turbines being installed in 2020. For me personally, that was a great project to see come to fruition. I began working on that in the early part of the prior decade. And yes, I said decades. These are a decade-long project typically by the time you move through all of the activities. But the nation's only permitted research lease with pilot turbines on it. So if we move to the next slide. So we're underway right now, and one of the focal points you'll hear about today are the activities surrounding the development of the CVAL commercial project. That will consist of 176 14.7 megawatt turbines that will be located 27 miles to 42 miles off the coast of Virginia, straight off Virginia Beach. And we're very excited about the project. And I can't stress how much the success of the 2 test turbine project has meant to the larger project, everything from permitting to constructability. And as we've been operating them, what we've learned on how to best operate turbines located offshore. So really good and interesting project. As you can see, we come ashore and then make our way across the Virginia Beach and Chesapeake areas to interconnect and get that power to our 500 kV network to send that around the Commonwealth of Virginia. Next slide. A couple of highlights. I'm not going to go through all these items, but you can tell that we've been diligently at work for a good period of time and took under some activities sooner than other parties, since we are a regulated utility that will, basically provide this power to our customers. So we went out for solicitations in 2020 and had all of our contracts wrapped up by the end of 2021. We're right now at a point, very soon, we should receive our final environmental impact statement. And then in October, we expect the record of decision to be issued by BOEM, with the COT to be issued at the end of January. As a result of this, we'll begin onshore work, and that's clearing and working land outside of wetlands in November of this year to get started on that transmission infrastructure. And then we expect to have all the turbines operating by the end of 2027, providing that 2,600 megawatts to our customers. Next. One of the challenges is we talk about here, and we talk about supply chain. Obviously, right now, we don't have, I'll say the offshore wind OEM manufacturing is nascent and beginning to develop. So you can see that the majority, or really all of our suppliers, are European. We took and looked at European contracting packages, broke our project up into those packages to go out for bid as we did that. And so, our project is a $9.8 billion project, and about 15% of that is the onshore, and the balance is all of the offshore project. Next slide. So going into that procurement process, starting in 2020 and wrapping up in 21, has really afforded us the opportunity to keep on schedule and on budget, and to do that in a lower risk approach. And by doing so, where we are today are that basically 90% of our project costs are fixed, and that's excluding the contingency. So certainly contingency is a big part of that. And we have seen tremendous capacity factor for our wind. And granted, these are 30-year life assets, and we've got 3 years with the 2 pilot turbines, but we're operating up in more of the higher 40% area, with the models predicting around 43% long term. And because we were able to get our costs fixed with the negotiations and then actively moving forward to put some hedges in place, we have been able to keep our levelized cost of energy between $80 and $90, which really we're towards that $80 range. So very excited about the project and looking forward to sharing our experiences as we move forward.
Great. Thank you so much, John. And finally, last but certainly not least, rounding out our panelists for introductions, I'd like to welcome James Martin, who's the Chief Executive Officer at Gulf Wind Technology. Gulf Wind Technology is a New Orleans-based company. One of their founding missions is to develop and demonstrate technologies that will remove barriers for offshore wind power in the Gulf of Mexico through innovations in safety, rotor design, and system operation in weather events such as hurricanes. And I know we're really excited to talk about that last one. James, over to you.
Superb. Thank you very much for the introduction. So, we're based, we've been in wind energy, actually operating out of Louisiana, the team, for a good number of years now. Been in the USA since the early 2010. But really, we were lucky to host the C2ES delegation back in March, where we got to talk about some of what we're doing with, you could say, solving the problems of today in wind energy so that we can be confident in what we're designing, curating as a technology roadmap for tomorrow's markets. So one of the programs that we're most proud of is actually the Shell-sponsored program, which is the Shell Gulf Wind Technology Accelerator Program. We're operating it here out of Avondale Shipyard in Louisiana, and really it's a demonstration of how we can leverage the oil and gas and shipbuilding infrastructure that exists on the Gulf of Mexico coast to actually come up with a path to demonstrating technologies so we can reduce the LCOE and demonstrate that we can actually get the desired cost structure and the desired low-risk supply chain ramp in the region. So it's the program's been going on through this year, and hopefully it's a program that will be running through the end of the decade. We're going to touch on that last point, Stephanie, in terms of, obviously it's a very complex market in the Gulf of Mexico due to the low wind speeds and the high peak wind events. But there's obviously a lot of demonstration of the workforce and the technologies to be applied on other emerging markets, and whether it's the East Coast, the West Coast, and hopefully demonstrating what we can do for the Gulf of Mexico transition as well. But the team here at Gulf Wind Technology, we range from aerodynamicists. We work very closely with the likes of NREL, like Matt talked about, in terms of taking the Department of Energy models, whether it be loads from the likes of a hurricane, whether it's the software packages, whether it's looking at the cost models, trying to predict that 10, 15 years out and what's going to happen to the LCOE over that time. So again, working with a number of collaborative partners in the region through GNO Wind, through the university frameworks, the local colleges and K through 12 programs, that if we're going to be talking about a workforce that starts in 27, 28, that's really the teenagers and the school systems and the teaching and learning frameworks of today. So we've got a full spectrum that we get engaged with from workforce, technology, and demonstration. And hopefully we'll be able to expand and answer everyone's questions today. So thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you. Great. So that is the introduction for each of our panelists. I'd now like to invite everyone to join me on the screen. Excellent. And we can get into some of the discussion that we're so excited to get to. So I know that this webinar is really focused on supply chain, and we've had a lot of conversations around collaborations and opportunities in the US, challenges in the US. I think I want to start with what the greatest supply chain needs are that we're facing right now. So I'm not sure if either of the companies want to start. I know, Matt, you touched on some of the broader US supply chain challenges currently. Let's start there. Maybe John, we can start with you.
Okay, yeah, super. As I referenced, we're in a little different position with moving forward with our contracting early on. So, we were able to take advantage of securing manufacturing slots and just advancing with the new technology for the larger turbines as they come about. And of course, I mentioned, we stepped up and put hedges in place for currency risk as well as our commodities. So we were able to do some things when you think about de-risking that you may not normally think about, which has really paid off for us and mitigated cost and schedule risk. I still think the biggest challenge we face today, and it was referenced in some of the earlier discussions, is the lack of Jones Act compliant vessels. As a result, Dominion Energy, Virginia's parent company, decided to move forward with the construction of Charybdis, which will be, a Jones Act compliant wind turbine installation vessel. It's being built in Brownsville, Texas currently. And it's very exciting to see that vessel come along, but it will be able to serve not only our project, but actually already has charters for installation of other projects on the East Coast. So that's just very beneficial for not only us, but de-risking for the industry. Certainly opportunity to see another wind turbine or two installation vessel definitely available. The other thing is moving forward, and there was a picture of a service ops vessel being constructed. Right now, working with Siemens Gamesa Renewable Energy, they have a partnership, and in Wisconsin, in fact, next month we'll lay the keel for that service op vessel that will be servicing the CVAL project as we move forward. So that's probably one of the biggest risk issues. We'll have over 50 vessels supporting the construction of the project, and Cape Shipping Agency is working to secure those vessels and make sure we have the resources to be Jones Act compliant, move forward with the construction.
Building upon the maritime perspective there, I think, that was one of the key supply chain areas where, seeing some constraints and just by way of competing industry cases, i.e., right, like these vessels that are needed by wind, for which Louisiana has ready to supply and also build, the 6 referenced by Matt, already publicly announced, still requires mariners that right now are facing some employment issues, mariners and service operators for any industry. There's a need for the workforce growth to sort of match both the building of these ships, but also these competing use cases, right? The industry is discussing, like John just referenced with the Charybdis there, that's queued up already for a set of projects. There's going to be a sense of sharing with that part of the supply chain. And with that, it becomes pretty necessary to make sure projects across the nation that are dependent upon these vessels are built. And that requires people. And I think this particular supply chain constraint more than any are really connected to the workforce challenge there. And even in a state like Louisiana, where we're privileged with an immense legacy in this work, there's a lot of workforce needs for these suppliers who are going to be building these ships and operating them to do what we're expecting of them for the national supply chain.
Yeah. I think building a little bit on John's point on a lot of these projects are planned so far out. So if you're predicting 10 years out, we've got to cover, I guess, the cost aspect. So cost is a huge challenge for the supply chain today. Both the headwinds that are being from inflation and actually some of the commodity materials availability, but also where we're going to be in terms of 5-10 years down the line in terms of being able to ramp up and predict the ramp of each component of that supply chain. So again, we've got a lot of competing targets. So we're talking about the US target of 40 gigawatts, by 2040. But essentially, you've got some other targets all the way around the world as well. So, not to mention the UK has a target of 50 gigawatts, going from 13.7 to 50. And that's going to consume, there's going to be a lot of challenge for the OEMs actually supplying the turbines, whether it's the towers, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's the HVDC, whether it's the rotors. And again, how those factories, where that manufacturing occurs, I guess to pick on Matt's point, whether it's going to be local content, whether it's going to be imported, when those decisions have to take place to be able to fulfill and to get the levelized cost of energy that's needed to make wind the right choice. So it's a very complex subject. But yeah, from my perspective, you've got the cost structure, which is a huge challenge. That's linked to the pace, timing, whether it's the policies or the planning or actually the speed to getting these projects to market. And then obviously there's another bit of a headwind in terms of quality. And again, that's something that is a little bit more about in the general media these days. But again, OEMs are becoming very, they're sharing their experiences with challenges of ramping new products and new markets extremely quickly. So these are things, and the reason I mention this is that these are the problem statements that technology startups, that federal governments, state governments, companies transitioning into renewables need to pick up on. And I think there's a lot of opportunity to work with programs such as some of the ones we talked about to curate the right roadmap to solve these problems over the next decade.
Yeah, I'll add one more perspective. As an economic developer, we work with companies to find locations to locate their operations and facilities, and really the unique requirements to set up some of these large manufacturing operations to develop a supply chain in the United States is really tough to meet. You need essentially large deep water sites, and those are very rare, even in an area like Hampton Roads, where we have a great harbor, one of the world's greatest natural harbors, a large maritime community, a lot of infrastructure built out. We're constrained with sites. And so when you look at the kind of availability of sites, in our community, a lot of the waterfront is already a working waterfront. And so site availability and site readiness to support these manufacturing facilities that have really, really unique requirements in terms of load bearing capacity and access, getting those sites ready in terms of kind of finding them in the cost to get them ready, I think is a constraint that we are going to need to continue to address in the future.
Yeah, everything Matt said from the economic development perspective here. And that's why I was really excited to see, this panel being between Virginia and Louisiana, because again, we both have these resources, and I'm seeing the same thing from that pipeline of manufacturers trying to set up hubs down here as well, which is, even with our 38 different deep draft ports inland, and upriver included, there's a certain amount of 60-acre manufacturing sites we'll be able to carve out of that with the draft necessary, the load bearing necessary that Matt referenced there. And then that also segues to action and some of the stuff we're going to talk about right with policy, because for Louisiana, there's a lot of shipyards that are actually, sort of closed due to a decline in oil and gas, activity, and are pretty viable with the right investment to be brought back into, the realm of being a viable site for some of these projects. And, James is already a testament to that, right? Avondale Shipyard is now Avondale Global Gateway. It used to be the largest employer in the region for shipbuilding, particularly for the U.S. Navy. And when those contracts dried out, it, basically went out as well. And, T. Parker Host has revitalized it. James is introducing new types of activities and purpose for that space. And I think we can expect with the right action, a lot of that to happen across other shipyards throughout the state that might be viable opportunities, not yet site ready.
And I would just maybe conclude this question by saying what Cam and Matt are saying is the perfect example of how to address what I think is the biggest problem that we see for the supply chain, which is that there's just a lack of strategic plans in place between all these different states and all the different participants. And the reason for that is because it's super hard. There are so many moving parts, lots of different states, lots of uncertainty. Everyone's busy with their day jobs. It's hard to step back and say okay, what does this look like over the next 10 years? But what everyone here is talking about is exactly what we need to do. We need to understand for example, at the Hampton Roads or the Port of New Orleans level, we need to understand what those areas can provide and want to provide for offshore wind, then aggregate that up to the state level and say, okay, as a state, here's what I can provide to offshore wind, and then coordinate and communicate that with all other states and regions in the US. And again, that's not a trivial task to do. And so that organization piece is hard. I mean, it's with the supply chain, there are fewer technology barriers than there are in terms of communication and planning barriers to understanding how to actually develop this. But just one piece is that although we throw these big numbers around, we need 20 or 30 billion dollars to stand up a supply chain. The money's not the problem. If you can get that supply chain in place, you could enable 100 or more billion dollars of projects to be built. So there's a return on that investment, but the uncertainty and the planning on that investment is I think the really challenging part.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect summary. And also something major that we heard between both of the roundtables was just looking at that long-term certainty and how you need that the recognition that there's going to be a secure project pipeline in order to make those investments, but you can't build the pipeline until you've made the investments. So how can we get this moving? How can we get agreements between developers, between states, among cooperative entities, like how Matt and Cam's organizations are leading this work? James, did you want to add anything, last little pieces before we move on?
Yeah, I think demonstration projects, we heard from John on that. I'm a huge believer that if you move, take the expertise that's been applied from a desktop study, collaborate in a very boundaryless way, and then actually demonstrate and validate, that plays a huge part in that confidence. Whether it's the finance structure, whether it's the speed or time to market, whether it's the right product selection, from either a revenue generation or a cost structure side of things. So I think that's all I'd say to line that up.
Great. Yeah, thanks. I want to kind of take this continued look far into the future at the next generation of projects that may be coming forward. And James, you kind of started getting at this with the folks that are going to be working on those projects at the end of this decade, beginning of next decade. They're in high school right now, or maybe they're in grade school. So what can we do to anticipate the needs of those coming projects, and specifically the workforce needs that will be coming, that we can, forecast are coming towards us, and how can we make sure that folks are ready to enter the workforce? James, I know you were already talking. Can I put you back on the spot?
Sure. I think first off, it's the engagement. I think the common thread is you've got to get out in front, and you've got to put the problem statement out there. You've got to let, and listening to the school. So actually getting in front of the not just the teachers and the principals and the chief of staffs and the superintendents, but really getting to that board level. If you're going to be affecting the teaching and learning syllabus, you've got to understand, well, is this a secure market? So in the same way that we've got to have confidence in the programs, actually to affect and change from an education level, they have to have confidence that this is the right path. So I think having the federal targets, having the state targets, having the market intelligence that come from the likes of GNO Wind, driven by Cam, allows all of that data, having the NREL data in terms of the overlays and the very specific market assessments, that gives the confidence to get the buy-in, and then you can actually stimulate the transition with the likes of the DOE programs. You've got this great collegiate wind program at university level, linking that in with the college, with the K through 12 level, so that there's continuity. So, you've got the teenagers of today, they can start to curate, whether it's STEM programs, whether it's a particular practical syllabus that get these emerging workforce aware of what they need to go in and study and get practical demonstration. And it's one aspect. We've got the workforce transition from oil and gas. I think this region has got an extremely strong framework for training already with schools and colleges and universities. So it's that transition, that sort of gap analysis of what we've got today, what we need tomorrow, and then coming up with that change management plan is pretty key.
From the economic development view, exactly what James said, just those close relationships and really working directly with these universities. So the H to the Future program I referenced earlier, which received a $50 million investment from the Economic Development Administration, matched $24.5 million by our state, has its greatest, investment really in community college curriculum development, because that's where accessible training is. That's where continued learning takes place. And that's how we're going to reach the next generation. But as well as James said, the balance of those who are ready to sort of transition and aren't, maybe a high school student, but certainly interested and excited about the opportunities that are coming from this. And I think there's really an important point about accessibility relevant to where jobs and communities will be created. And again, that when you don't have to reinvent the wheel, where we're talking about gaps between investment and certainty, they are able to really tune what they're already providing industry. Nunez Community College or others are already really strongly connected to these oil and gas employers that are sort of relying on this curriculum and training. And they're really strong bases for converting to offshore wind. So we're not requiring too much forward investment without certainty for them to provide really strong skill sets to the students who are interested in participating in this. And I think with that, community college participation and focus couldn't be emphasized enough on top of that K through 12 point that James was making there.
Hey, one thing I'll throw out real quick. is Dominion Energy's charitable foundation. We mentioned reaching young school age kids today. Our foundation funded through NEED, it's an organization in DC, the development of an offshore wind curriculum. And it's really broken down into 4 different groups, K through 3, then finish in elementary, middle school, and high school. And it provided curriculum that's approved, like in Virginia, for the standards of learning, and was based on that. But that curriculum is available to any school. We also trained 128 teachers on how to use that curriculum, even provided coverage for their substitutes and their travel and overnight stays. So making those types of investments are really critical to getting that out, for the workforce as we move forward. And of course, this all started during the COVID era, and some of it was virtual with us. But, those teachers being able to speak to middle schoolers and high schoolers who will be the ones that will be ready to finish the construction of CVAL and work as part of the operations infrastructure is pretty critical.
That's a really good program, John. I think there's pilot. I think that bringing up the point of actually knowledge sharing, the role of institutions that span borders, or actually the likes of NREL, that get involved, have got far-reaching into every state, but sharing the information, sharing the best of best programs. We're doing a similar thing in Louisiana with the K through 12 program. It's part of the Shell GWA, but sharing the lessons learned, getting involved. And again, the OEMs, there's the equipment manufacturers are also interested in both where the workforce comes from to build the components, to deploy and assemble the components, and then obviously operations and maintenance, which is a huge opportunity for employment, and already is across onshore wind, across the 80,000 turbines onshore wind today. But transitioning both mariners and energy companies that are from offshore operations, but also from those onshore operation diversification is pretty interesting.
I think sorry.
Oh, sorry, Cam. I just wanted to say, I think like on the workforce piece as well, I think that it's like it's obviously a huge opportunity. These training programs are so exciting to hear about, and really engaging people almost at the kindergarten level to get them into the offshore wind workforce is great. I think the thing that's important, and I assume is probably part of these type of programs, is conveying and making sure that offshore wind's an interesting industry. Like, these are good jobs to get into. So, we're not looking for like menial labor, or just people that are kind of warm bodies in a suit. I mean, these are careers that we're trying to define for people, and it's and it's one end of the scale. You need a PhD and a postdoc and a specialization to do like very, very advanced modeling work, and the other end, it might be a high school or a vocational school training. But either way, I mean, the IRA tax incentives require these to be like good paying prevailing wage jobs with apprenticeship programs. Again, like really thinking about the career standpoint. And I think that we need to be realistic as well about, as we develop this workforce, again, what type of workforce are we looking for? And we want to do a lot of manufacturing, but there's also potentially a role for automation, and the trade-off between, what are we automating and what do we need, sort of what's the right skill set to enable sort of a high-tech or future-looking manufacturing workforce, and how do we train people to fill those type of jobs, which are going to be, again, the longest lasting, best paying, and most impactful to the industry as well. So I think that just that the quality of job is something that we should be highlighting as what we're aiming for as an industry.
That's a really good topic, Matt. I'm a huge believer in manufacturing-led design. So if you've got an emerging industry with this amount of volume, this amount of revenue coming into CapEx deployment, reducing LCOE comes on a number of levels, from both manufacturing-led design of the component, right sizing the turbine, the height of it, the rotor sizes, how things are sub-assembled, where it's done, where appropriate automation is. And Matt, you bang on. I think if there's going to be appropriate regional content, obviously the global OEMs are always, we need to import, we need to embrace importing components, but we also need to stimulate, and I think there is some in there within the IRA. You know, there's a tailwind there for to reduce the barrier to entry for automation and domestic manufacturing, and that's something that's huge. Agreed. This is more like the automotive industry. In fact, the industry would benefit from and be very public about that. You know, quality. You know, this is a serial production industry. This is the largest serially produced composite component on the planet with blades. There needs to be investment in automation, the workforce that can drive that, can get the right throughput. It's a really interesting area. Agreed.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm conscious of time, and I want to make sure that we've got time to get to the questions coming in from our audience, and also a reminder to our audience that you can submit questions using the Q&A box. Before we shift to some of those, I did want us to bring the conversation to the community side. So looking at what could the opportunity be, or what does the opportunity look like for communities that are hosting projects, that are living near projects, that are hosting the manufacturing facilities. How can they take advantage of these projects? And then I think also kind of rolled into that is, what does a successful community engagement strategy look like on the part of companies? John, you leaned forward a little bit when I started to ask that question, so I wonder if you can kick us off.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'm going to first just say, you know, the opportunities are clearly there and they're in front of them. So I'll use a scenario we've been, you know, talking about the field of dreams. If you build it, they will come, since really 2020. And, you know, now we're moving forward, and I'll start a little bit with the supply chain and the local businesses, right? So, you know, these companies are shaking off the COVID hangover. Now they're dealing with interest rate and inflation. But there's a lot of great programs. I think I heard Matt mention the Commonwealth has a program for grants to help industry purchase machinery and for facility expansion, which is pretty critical as far as that goes. And then, you know, as we get into the workforce side of it, there are tremendous programs in most states that allow pretty much, if you want to learn a trade and you're below roughly, you know, the mid $90,000 income in Virginia, you can get you know, pretty much free training to do any type of trade. And folks are really looking at how to optimize and shorten these programs to get workers out there, highly skilled, that are out there. Let me just jump to the engagement piece really quick. You know, we started with forming a grass tops advisory committee in which we had, you know, a number of representatives from diverse communities, the Asian community, Hispanic community, African American, and the Native American community. And, you know, the great thing about that is we gained a lot of insights from them as we went through that. And we met twice monthly, fantastic, you know, gains that we made. But what they really did is help us further the trust and relationship with those communities in Virginia. So as we move forward, working with them, the introductions they made, and then our traditional economic development organizations such as Hampton Roads Alliance and others, you know, we were able to really get out there and have simple, direct, and really great communications. And they pushed us into non-traditional ways of communicating and reaching those communities to get them involved. And I'll just throw one out there. A basketball tournament, high school basketball tournament, right? You would think, what in the world would you ever go there to talk about offshore wind for? Well, every kid got a package about offshore wind. But the best thing was we had several tables where parents and grandparents coming by to stop and ask about offshore wind. And what that enables is when that kid sits down at the kitchen table and says, hey, I think I want to go into offshore wind versus the shipbuilding industry. Now, you know, their parent or grandparent can say, oh, yeah, I heard about that. I can see how that's a great clean energy career versus, you know, your dad, your uncle, and your brother all work at the shipyard. So you get down there and get in that apprenticeship program and work in the shipyard. So we gained a lot from our partners. And really what that's led to is, you know, I've made, you know, we've had over 500 meetings and touched 15,000 people and hundreds of nights in hotels and traveling on the road, is getting into the communities and small group meetings tend to be much more effective than larger meetings. And getting that trust, then you can get in with those communities. So it's really, I'll say, hand to hand, going out and campaigning for all intents and purposes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we heard in our Virginia roundtable as well as in Louisiana that it's so important to listen to communities too. And I think that's so fantastic that that's what you've been doing, is really asking communities where they see themselves in the transition or in the opportunity and what concerns they might have that you can make sure that you're proactively addressing. I also love the idea of a basketball tournament, and I'm sure there's a pun in there somewhere of like swish or like some kind of offshore wind puns. So I would love to see if you had any cool punny materials. Cam, did you want to add to this conversation on community engagement? Oh, looks like we lost him. Well, he can jump back in when he gets back.
I can add something.
Yeah, go for it, Matt.
Just to build on a little bit about what John was talking about the importance of working with community serving institutions and organizations. I think that's where the key is. As a developer or even an economic development organization, we probably don't have the direct ties to the communities that others do, but there are organizations in probably every community that have very close ties to groups that do want access to better jobs. And so working with those community serving organizations, also with community colleges that are kind of already geared up to taking, I would say, like non-traditional students and getting them into an actual career path. And our workforce, we have a really great workforce development council in Hampton Roads. So I think the capacity is there to get into these communities. And there is now funding that are going to these community colleges and workforce councils to help them transition their programs into maritime programs that include offshore wind. So we're already seeing that happen in Virginia. And so I think it's just really a matter of kind of building up our capacity through these existing organizations to get down into communities and make sure that we're touching the right people and also providing services, not just training, but services to people that would allow them to go back to school. And so that the capacity is being built now, I think.
Yeah, that's so important. Let's go James, Matt, Cam.
Just to share a few things that I've seen work extremely well in this region is we've been very lucky to have some conferences come to New Orleans recently. So there's been American Clean Power, there's been C2ES, there's been Business Network for Offshore Wind, and that brings a cross section of industry, certainly people to demystify wind. I've certainly hosted a number of people at the accelerator here to touch, feel, blades, tower sections, components that have come through, and that resonates. So again, the roles like that C2ES has in terms of sharing that information, having open forums, has been invaluable. So we can touch, hundreds of people each year can come through and have some understanding of what the industry is about, what components are about, the lead times of these programs, everything from understanding how it affects sort of avian population, getting it all out, and anything that can be in communities could be concerned about, whether it's fishing industry, whether it's the avian population, whether it's the impact on where cables go and how supply chain, but that's been extremely valuable. So,
and I'll follow on to what you're saying there, James, and I think that because it's a good point, which is that there's a lot of potential topics that are really important, and those vary a lot from community to community. So every community is different. There are so it's not right to assume that there's a single one size fits all solution to community engagement or a community benefit agreements or anything like that. So there has to be this engagement for early on, and I think that. I think it's important, and one of the things we've been working towards kind of conveying on the NREL side is that engagement doesn't mean just listening to a community and then doing whatever you want anyways. It's actually meaningful interaction and engagement and feedback and empowering people in the community to be able to drive you towards an effective solution that works for everyone. And I think the point of that is at the end of the day, even though that's time consuming and expensive and challenging and hard at the beginning of the project, there's an avoided issue down the road where you are suddenly in some conflict with the community. You're being sued. You're running into cost overruns and schedule delays because it's an issue that could have been solved earlier with the right type of engagement. So I think that there's certainly an opportunity to provide more like communication about lessons learned between like developers, for example, and manufacturers in different states, but then understanding like how you really do have to tailor everything to your local, the local needs and the local communities is really critical as well.
Yeah, and I would say that, the common thread between a lot of points being made here, and certainly the emphasis we operate under, is just reducing barriers to entry. And I think this is something that applies for both workforce and supply chain, meaning reducing the burden placed on these communities, these universities, and even again these smaller, medium-sized companies where, as Matt alluded to, there's a great opportunity for the supply chain to get them engaged, is reducing that barrier for them to target these opportunities and understand a pretty, as we know, volatile market at times as this nascent industry takes off here. And I think particularly with community engagement, again, like environmental justice and equity becomes further dependent upon reducing these barriers. We're, through H to the Future, partnering with the Louisiana Black Chamber of Commerce to focus on diverse procurement programs, Louisiana Parole Project to target, and with support from a labor analysis we're doing with TPM Bay to really identify where there's reentry positions in offshore wind, in these tertiary and, less site sensitive opportunities as well. And so, that's also by way of communication what GNO Wind is as a free program. Just monthly, they can count on updates, some clarity based off the various headlines they're seeing day to day. And I think consistent communication and just targeting those right barriers to reduce will do wonders for just getting more communities, companies, and universities to, again, buy in and invest in pursuit of the offshore wind industry opportunities, which really circles back to what we were talking about that circular dilemma between certainty and investment and getting this ball rolling here. And I think reducing barriers is pretty key to all of that.
Yeah, I'm so glad that's where you ended that, because looking at time, we're down to just a couple minutes left. So I want to take us, I know some of this came in the audience questions. I also have these questions. I want to take us to the last policy discussion. And I know policy, we could have another entire webinar on this. So maybe let's keep it very, very brief. What kinds of policies, or maybe one specific example of a policy, do you want to see enacted either at the federal or state level to address some of these challenges we've been talking about within the supply chain, within the workforce, and really make sure that we're best able to take advantage of the opportunity? Matt, do you want to start us off?
Maybe that was me. We have at least 2 Matts on the panel, which is the minimum quota for Matts on a conference. I don't know if I would call it a policy, but I would say a mechanism for de-risking these investments. And so, one of the things we talk about is vessels, which is a major risk to the supply chain. Part of that is how vessel contracts are structured. It's kind of hard to go to the bank unless you have a series of vessel contracts in place, and that's hard when the projects aren't quite there yet. So sort of a backstop or a funding mechanism that could help bridge gaps between contracts, for example, would be a way that particular part of the industry could be de-risked.
I'll go next with the other Matt. So I'm going to go pretty macro with this and say that I'm not going to talk about probably a particular policy in general, but you don't have a supply chain without a project pipeline. So I think whatever policies at the federal and state level that can facilitate the development of more projects is probably at the macro level the most important thing, because we're not going to see that investment in the supply chain unless there is certainty that you're going to be able to supply those components to projects. And so I think right now the foundation of this industry is state renewable energy mandates. So making sure that those are secure, expanding those. And then I'm really excited to see what comes out of using some of this auction money to go back into supply chain development for future projects. So just more projects, the better.
And I'll piggyback off of that, because our state has been extremely successful with that kind of project creation and market, scale type of policy by way of creating legislation that enabled state water exploration for development, for which the first 3 projects are going through what's an operating agreement structure with the state right now to explore. What we need to do sort of, to finish that certainty equation is focus on developing the state's solicitation and procurement process. We actually, this past session, had $4 million go towards a state offshore wind master plan. Matt Shields said how important state plans, as well as them connecting to the national plans, are. So it's really exciting to see that the policy wish is sort of coming true there, but we have 2 years of a lot of really intense work to identify those answers and develop a really strong plan for the state. But what we hear the most from developers is right now, Louisiana needs a stronger pathway towards actual procurement of these energy resources to be really viewed as a strong option for these projects to service and to warrant further scale in the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah, Cam brings up a good point. I think, yeah, offtake. I think you got to know there's different price points for PPAs. I mean, that seeing what stimulated the onshore wind industry, that some of it's been slightly boom and bust, but it's actually stabilized now. It's in a good place. You've got a really good LCOE from onshore. I think it's quite a lot of challenge in terms of the offtake, the revenue part of the equation. So any joined up thinking and master plans that link from federal to state to utility, I think that's going to go a long way.
Thanks. John, do you want to take us home?
Yeah, I and looking at and being a developer, there's a whole lot of great policy out there, the IRA and the resources available with that. And I think it's imperative that as developers that we make sure we also get out and work with any and all stakeholders so that as we go into our permitting processes, then we've already addressed those issues and they can be properly adjudicated. And, in the early phases and early stages of an industry, a lot of issues come up that have not been reviewed or adjudicated before. So I think we've seen some of that take place, particularly on the East Coast. It's good. We need everybody involved. But as we advance the industry, getting out and doing that work up front and having that engagement is just critical to success. And then if we do that, then I think the primary thing that comes down is surety of permitting schedules. So making sure agencies are properly staffed and that they are ready to move forward in doing that. So if you get that permitting surety, you take care of working with your stakeholders, then you should have a more clearly and really more efficient and shorter development pipeline would let people move forward with making those investments we've talked about. So I think those are pretty key issues.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Well, thank you, everyone. We are so grateful that you joined us today for this webinar. Thank you to our panelists and presenters. This was a fantastic discussion. I wish we could be on here for another 8 hours, but I know it's probably lunchtime in the Gulf of Mexico. So I will let you all go. Thank you again for your time. Thanks to everyone watching. The recording will be available on our YouTube channel within a day.